So thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Nick Palmer of Compassion in World Farming. And I'm very proud to say you are my first podcast guest for C.L.E.A.R. So thank you very much for agreeing to do this, especially at such short notice.
I'm honored.
Thank you. So may I first just ask you how you ended up being where you are?
Well, I was a member of Parliament for 13 years from 1997 to 2010. And because I did a lot of work on animal welfare issues during that time and to some extent broader environmental issues, it was natural once I lost my seat to look for work within the animal welfare NGO sector. And so that's really how I ended up as head of Compassion's UK team. It was felt that because of the parliamentary experience, it would be useful to have the team led by someone familiar with it, because it makes it easier to know how to talk to ministers and other MPs.
Absolutely. And I think that's a skill in itself. But do you mind if I backtrack a little bit from that? What led you into identifying this field initially? I mean, how did you come across the what was the calling really before you became an MP?
Well, originally I studied mathematics and worked in IT, and I was always interested in politics, just on the usual idealistic sort of let's change the world basis. And in a naive sort of way, I was just always fond of animals. I used to live with animals, and so it was a natural focus for when I was in Parliament and subsequently.
Okay. But I would imagine your time in Parliament then sort of exposed you to the world as it is now in a way that being a civilian, if you like, could never do.
Yes.
Or should I say a consumer, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of slightly neatly segues us into the reason for C.L.E.A.R. So how were you first aware of C.L.E.A.R. and yeah, can you just tell me a bit about how and why you support the aims of C.L.E.A.R.?
Well, Compassion in World Farming has always taken the view that there's a place for animal farming if it's higher welfare and doesn't have terrible impacts either on the animals or the environment around them. So we have a long-standing partnership with, for instance, the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, because we feel that pasture-fed animals generally have much better life than factory-farmed animals. And I think it was Felicity at the PFLA who took the initiative for C.L.E.A.R. And we thought, yeah, this is something we'd like to support.
Fidelity. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I said yes. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Because I do feel in some ways the initial goal of Pasture for Life and C.L.E.A.R. are sort of quite linked, or more like the problem that C.L.E.A.R. identifies is almost the reason for Pasture for Life's existence. And it's that line in DEFRA food labeling that says, meat from animals that were fed a diet of predominantly grass can be labeled as grass-fed, and that's just one of many misleading tags that I think we'll get into. But could you please just explain to those that in a little more detail what Compassion in World Farming, or who are you talking to? What are your goals and aims, and what are you exactly trying to achieve with the campaign?
Well, our one sentence goal is to end factory farming. And arising out of that, we favour a shift in farming systems, not just an improvement to this or that type of barn or cage, but an overall shift to a sustainable, regenerative, agro-ecological approach, which wouldn't rule out animal farming, but inevitably would lead to a reduction in meat production and consumption. And our long-term objective is perhaps summarized as less and better in terms of meat. We have 400,000 supporters in Britain, where you define supporter as someone who's been in touch the last couple of years. Obviously some are more engaged than others, and we use that support to influence the political world, because there's 650 MPs. 400,000 supporters means that any MP will have quite a lot of constituents who are interested in the subject and who would like to see him taking an initiative here. And obviously, every constituent will have other concerns as well. But certainly, as an MP, if a couple of hundred of my constituents expressed a keen interest in anything, whatever, I would feel, I need to take an interest in this. I need to understand it and to consider whether it's something I could take an initiative on. And a lot of our work is really in terms of mobilizing that support with specific requests to MPs. And we also try to conduct a very constructive dialogue with DEFRA and with the food industry and with the National Farmers Union, because our objective is to get a broad consensus on these issues. We're not a confrontational organisation. We're perfectly happy to campaign vigorously as the situation requires, but we don't identify anybody as the enemy.
Right. Yep.
Ultimately, we think farmers mostly are people just trying to make a decent living. And if they can do that, if they can have a profitable existence based on high welfare farming, or indeed non-animal farming, as depending on their interests and possibilities, then they'll be up for it. I've never met a farmer who said, what I really like about farming is the ability to cram animals into cages. It's
Brilliantly
would
put.
just be eccentric, And
Yeah.
we don't try to say we're not saying to farmers, we appreciate that what we recommend will lose you money, but you should do it because of, we appeal to your better nature. What we're trying to do is encourage a system that it is profitable, indeed more profitable than anything else, to work on an agro-ecological basis and to put that more into the world and more into animal welfare than was there before.
That's really fascinating. So, as you're explaining now, I've kind of identified that you've got the kind of the lobbying angle. You've got obviously you're talking to the public, because otherwise you wouldn't have 400,000 supporters. You're also talking to farmers and people who are able to make the change. And presumably there's an awful lot of research that you guys are either looking at or undertaking as to, becoming aware of, assuming animal behaviors, animal feeds, and what I like to call non-anthropogenic views on animal welfare. Accepting the fact that our ideas of welfare do not directly translate to every different farmed animal, because we've all evolved from different ways. But the bit in that I really would like to pick your brain about a bit more is, well, two questions, and one of them is going to be me playing devil's advocate. I don't agree with this statement, but I have heard it made often that there is a case for factory farming because it provides cheap protein to people, and we need cheap protein. And I've identified that I think there are 35 million chickens consumed in the UK every week, which is an absolute shocking number, because the vast majority of those will never see the light of day. It's also my understanding that although factory farming produces very cheap food, it's actually very low margin, because it's a high level of inputs and a low value of outputs. How does an agro-ecological model change that for the farmer?
Well, firstly, to respond to the devil's advocate challenge,
Thank you.
one substantial problem about the current system is it's not sustainable. Um, that if your model of farming is to have farms which are dependent on a continuous supply of grain, soya, and so on to feed the intensive farm, then effectively you're dependent indirectly on forest clearances in the Amazon, on imports from predominantly from South America, but also from other countries, um, which sooner or later will simply not be available because there is a limit to how many forests you can clear, how much land there is to plant on. Um, and from that point of view, if you were interested in maintaining a farming business over a long term, then you really need to get out of that model into something that isn't so dependent on an unrestricted flow of inputs from around the world. Sooner or later, that will reach its limits. And in addition, it's vulnerable to supply shocks, as we've seen quite recently.
So,
So,
sorry, can I just ask?
yeah,
So, yeah, I just want to sort of almost surmise what you just said. So, regardless of the animal welfare and the
yeah,
health issue, um, one reason for stopping factory farming is simply because it is an unsustainable model, and
yeah,
eventually it will run out. So, we need to shift that paradigm, regardless of
yeah,
all the other reasons which we can get into.
yeah.
Okay.
No, that's right. Because we started from an animal welfare position, it's natural for people to say, well, yeah, you would say that because you're trying to reduce the impact on animal welfare. But it's very well established, and people with no particular interest in animal welfare, um, such as Henry Dimbleby with National Food Strategy, have recognised the same problem. So um, it's it's helpful to our animal welfare argument, but it's also valid by itself. And I haven't even started to talk about the environmental impact of intensive farming, the effluent produced, the impact of monocultures, and all the rest of it, which I think some of your other interviewees can probably say more about than I can. But the overall model is very much geared to short-termism.
Right.
Now, um, I do think that we shouldn't be blasé about the need to provide inexpensive food, because otherwise we turn into a sort of first world organization saying, "Oh dear, I'm afraid we can't afford to feed you." Um, the and there are two ways of looking at that. One is that it is the duty of governments to ensure that poverty is driven out from the populations that they're responsible for, and outsourcing that to the food industry and saying, well, just find some cheap food to give them, isn't an adequate way of tackling poverty, and especially not if it's not sustainable. And the second point is that it is possible that over the medium term we will find that non-animal farming, the laboratory grown meat and non-meat alternatives actually are cheaper than um, an animal farm because ultimately running a farm full of animals is a complex and often expensive business.
Yeah.
And potentially it is possible that over the medium term that there are cheaper alternatives.
So we might be, as we transition to a more agro-ecological solution, we may have to consider what we can grow natively. I'm sure you read Feeding Britain, the Sustainable Food Trust report, When you were talking there, you just kind of reminded me of a lot of the recommendations on there, which was grazing animals provide such incredible ecosystem services that we really actually need to integrate those onto arable land. But that report suggested that we replace a lot of the white meat with natively grown grains, beans, and pulses, which can provide the protein that we're currently getting from 35 million chickens. But we're slightly going to jump because I did ask you another question there we haven't quite got to. But
Right.
I think in terms of the whole concept of regenerative agriculture, it's often referred to in relation to grazing animals and the kind of savory techniques of holistic management. And I think people can understand that of moving cattle around and the grass grows more and the ecosystem services. But I'm aware of systems that can do similar things with white meat, with monogastrics, with poultry and pigs. Why do you think there's a sort of knowledge gap there in the fact that poultry and pigs can also provide beneficial ecosystem services?
Um, I think I'll say pass to that
Okay,
because I think some of the people you're interviewing will give you a better answer.
sure. Okay,
I can have a shot at it, but it's not an area where I'm in any way an expert, and I think I
fair
might not
enough.
be helpful.
Okay. In that case, can we jump to the second part of my original question, which was how does uh, just looking at the margins on an industrial system
Yeah.
versus margins on a natural system. I've seen some farmers who are pushed into regenerative farming through not being able to afford inputs, and then suddenly realizing they don't need them. And the knock-on effect of that was almost no input, but then also having a higher valued output. So how is compassionate world farming getting that message to farmers? And is it becoming received, or is there a real kind of this is how it's done mindset?
Well, I think if you're an individual farmer and you've perhaps either bought or inherited a farm which has a particular farming system, then the default is going to be to carry on doing exactly what you're doing now. We're all like that, and
Yeah.
every aspect of our lives. Um, the we aren't primarily trying to tackle the problem by persuading individual farmers one by one. Um, the obviously will be helpful whenever a farmer approaches us, but primarily we're trying to change the system so that the system nudges farmers towards a more profitable business by having less intensive, higher welfare approaches. Um, and there we come into the primary objective of C.L.E.A.R,
Hmm.
that if you do produce meat or dairy products to a higher standard, and we can debate exactly what higher standard means, but if we assume it is genuinely higher standard, if you can't then distinguish your product from a range of products produced to lower standards, then you're kind of stuffed because the you the market which is out there, which would like to use your uh, products, like to consume your products, can't tell the difference between your products and somebody else's. Um, and that applies especially when you come to imports, because it's unreasonable to expect somebody exporting to you from, let's say, Ukraine,
Hmm.
to be familiar with the British regulations and to adapt to them. So we have to define what we want and what we want the label to say so that people can make informed choices. And we always go back here to the egg example,
Hmm.
where um, initially most eggs were produced from battery cages. And when it was clearly identified that there are really three types of egg, the battery or improved battery cages, there's barns, and there's free range. Then consumers looked at the choice and they overwhelmingly voted with their wallets to move towards the higher welfare systems. And then individual farm didn't need to come and talk to Compassionate World Farming to see the way things were going. They could see that if they moved to a free range approach, there was more money in it. And I don't think one should be cynical about that. If your business is being a farmer, then you naturally want to make a decent living out of it. And to some extent, it's the job of government and of consumers to make it worth their while to move in what we collectively feel is a positive direction. And that's what happened with eggs. Generally, I think the egg industry was kind of neutral. They basically said, people would like cheap eggs, then we'll produce lots of cheap eggs with using battery cages. But it wasn't because they were secretly controlled by the battery cage industry. It was merely that they were responding to demand. So if you have labels which clearly identify what you're buying, you then have the opportunity to make an intelligent, informed choice, which can reinforce farmers producing to higher standards. And I think that's perfectly fair demand by farmers. If they say, if you're asking me to produce these higher standards, how are you going to make sure that I get an adequate reward from it? And telling consumers that what it is a pretty substantial part of that.
Mate, yeah, that's amazing. That's really incredible because I think from what you were just saying there, I think a common misconception of the consumer view of factory farming is that it's being done because it's so profitable. And my understanding is that the margins are very, very low. It's a numbers game. The inputs are very high and very costly, and the outputs are very low value. So it kind of makes every sense: welfare, human health, ecosystem to move to a higher welfare system. Everybody benefits.
That's right. One of the things, you become less dependent on movements in the exchange rate. So if the pound deteriorates, and you may suddenly find that your inputs from abroad become much more expensive. Well, you can go the other way as well.
Right.
But if you're trying to run a profitable business, you don't really want it dependent on external factors over which you have no control.
Sure, that's a really important point. Yeah, and particularly, I think that for me, a very sort of contentious issue, which I think we need to decouple ourselves from, is the reliance on Brazilian or South American soy. It has to be brought down. I know that there's a lot of arguments to say that soy meal is a byproduct of pressing for oil, but it's still a product with high value, which means farmers want to produce it. I'd just like to sort of pick up on, you were talking there a bit about free range, but I've done a little investigation for C.L.E.A.R on free range, and I found it to be a very murky term, which I think is misused. What's your take from Compassionate World Farming on the use or on the standards that allow the term free range to be used? Could you explain it a little bit to me, please?
We do define for each individual species, because if you want to have a free range chicken, you will have different requirements of what you have. You want to have a free range cow, or let's say a cow free to live in the open and eat on pasture. And as an animal welfare organization, we are primarily motivated to look at what animals find is an environment that enables them to live naturally, and as far as we can tell, to live a life with pleasure. As you hinted at earlier, talking about the anthropomorphic approach. There's a danger that we extrapolate what we might like to what a duck might like. And
Good
there is a
example.
lot of academic research to look at what animals naturally seem to want. So actually offering a choice where, let's say, a chicken has the option to be inside the barn or outside. And this is actually a mistake to assume that every animal behaves like every other animal. Speaking personally, I'm not a great fan of going for long walks, so I don't go out as much as some other people do. And the having a choice there does show up differences in individual behavior. Nonetheless, we can say, on the basis of a lot of research, that the ability to engage in the natural functions of that animals have, so ability to nest and to spread wings and so on, that this does seem to be pretty fundamental to animals finding that life is tolerable.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I love that idea of applying species-specific criteria to welfare. I think that's super important. But if I could just go back to, I please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would only ever buy free-range eggs in a supermarket. But from my limited understanding, there is a huge variation in how eggs can be produced between what is the legal definition of free range and then like a true pasture system where their chickens are sort of grazing on pasture and then coming into roost at night versus a barn where I think you can have 9 chicken per square meter and then a door open at the back, which they may or may not even be aware that they have access to. Is that correct?
I don't know the precise figure offhand, but it's certainly correct. There's a huge range from the basic legal minimum to the maximum that you could offer. And as far as possible, we'd like to enable consumers to see that there is a range of possibilities and to decide how far up the range they'd like to go. I was in Denmark a couple of years ago looking at their classification system, their labeling system, and they typically have 4 or 5 categories, from very high welfare to minimal welfare, and that reflects the fact that it's not a binary choice where you say either it's great or it's terrible. But the only counterfactor is you don't want to confuse consumers by having too many factors. So it's no good expecting somebody standing in the supermarket aisle to start reading barcodes and studying different complex labels and choosing between 11 different levels and so on. So there's a trade-off there. To some extent, you have to compromise and say, maybe we have perhaps 4 levels, where 1 is merely the legal minimum, 4 is the absolute maximum, which you can see is still viable and practical, and then 2 and 3 would be levels in between. And I think we have to recognize that in any system and in any conceivable situation, there's going to be there is going to be a cost difference. That if you provide the best possible environment, it's likely to be more expensive than a good but not ideal environment.
Sure.
So I wouldn't like to say that a barn system, for instance, is necessarily just as bad as a cage system. It's not. It's also not as good as a free range system where access to the open is evident to the animals and frequently used. So not just a tiny back door, as you say, but actually part of the normal lived experience of the animal. So we need to reflect that, and we need to encourage honesty about it. And the basic requirement that labels are honest is something that commands support right across the political spectrum. Even if you're quite conservative, quite free market, you nevertheless want informed consumers, because otherwise your free market doesn't work. If the consumers sort of taking a pig in the poke, to take an inappropriate phrase, then they're going to distort the market by making all kinds of random choices. Whereas if you've got informed consumers, then you can try to persuade consumers to encourage higher welfare and a better environmental impact.
So you're talking more of a carrot approach than a stick approach of like leading change through encouraging better consumer behavior, rather than massively enforcing, but actually doing that through properly informed choices. And at the moment, I think the choices that, as you said, things are very confusing. I was talking to one of the members of C.L.E.A.R who showed me a website that listed, I think, 600 different eco labels from around the world, and they all have different criteria, which means that they pretty much become meaningless because unless you, as you said, scan the barcode and fully Google it, it's verging on meaningless. And
that's really difficult because unless you have a well-established central brand, then it's very hard for people to tell, is high welfare Tesco better or worse than high welfare Sainsbury? Unless you're an expert, you struggle to answer that. Just going back to your earlier point for a moment, we do favour both carrot and stick. We see labelling as half the answer, but the other half is mandatory minimum standards. And there are forms of agriculture which are so cruel that really we think they shouldn't be legal at all. If we're talking about routine castration without anaesthetic, for instance, it's very difficult to justify that, and I don't think a label is sufficient for that. I think shouldn't be allowed.
Just needs to be banned. Yeah, I completely agree.
But there will be a range of things which you think range from not great to really good, where it might not be appropriate to say the not great we're going to make illegal. There comes a point where you say some things are legal, but you still don't entirely like them.
Right. So we absolutely do need to redraw the line in the sand, as it were.
Yeah.
And I completely agree with you on that. I think we've become a bit desensitized to the poor practices. But that should be really the role of government, right? To tell that. Okay. And I know obviously that I'll be really intrigued as to your answer to this next one, and I hope it doesn't throw you off. But we've talked earlier about how confusing the different existing labels are. Is that why Compassion in World Farming has maybe not produced their own certification, for example?
Yes. We aren't an organization which has the resources to classify every piece of meat on the market. If we did that, we'd do nothing else, and even then we wouldn't get through it. So we argue that our role is to encourage a good labeling system rather than to be a labeling system ourselves. then frankly, there are people out there who are probably better than us at um, uh, enforcing a detailed labeling scheme, but who are perhaps agnostic on exactly what that labeling scheme should be. So their speciality is looking at a farm and saying, does it meet the following 6 criteria? And they will say to you quite openly, you tell us what the criteria you want are, and we will classify farms accordingly. Now, that brings us into the well-established systems like Red Tractor and RSPCA and so on. And there, we would argue that the systems as they currently exist, particularly Red Tractor, don't offer the level of animal welfare that people think they do. We don't say they're useless. They do. They offer a certain level above the legal minimum, but we think they could go much further. And we do have a dialogue with them, and we encourage them to move up the scale, and to some extent they have. But there's a long way to go. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
no, I completely agree. I read when I was kind of new to this world, I read what the Red Tractor standards were, and they barely seemed beyond common sense to me as a non-farming person. I mean, I was actually quite shocked at how low the bar was for that particular. I'm not so familiar with the RSPCA, but it really, to me, it seemed like anyone with a non-farming background would know that a lot of the things it says not to do for Red Tractor are just simply wrong. It was pretty shockingly basic, and yeah, that's really interesting. Rather than creating some new kind of hyper wonderful system, we do need to raise the bottom end, and that I think the great thing about that is it will have even moving the baseline by 10% will have a bigger impact than moving the top end by 50% because that's where the mass market is, right?
Yes, that's right. And it's an intensively competitive mass market. And that's why you have these very narrow margins that you referred to earlier. So yes, I think a typical farming business will say to you, if you want to set the bar a bit higher, that's okay, as long as you give us reasonable notice so we can adjust. And so long as you don't undercut us by allowing people to produce to lower standards and somehow portray it as adequate. And that's our big criticism of some of the trade deals, that not only do we give access to British markets for food produced at a very low welfare standard, but we actually have offered zero tariff access to these products. So the traditional protection against really rubbishy products, if I can express it that way, is that there is a default tariff on the imported goods. And in a trade deal, what you typically do is you say, I will give you a zero tariff on these goods, and you in turn will give me a zero tariff on those goods. Now, in the Australian deal, the government actually accepts that the impact of a deal was negative to the British agriculture, British farming industry, but they say that it was better for other industries like Scottish whisky. From a purely financial point of view, seeing the world purely in economic terms, you can say, well, okay, allowing lower welfare imports from Australia without any financial penalty, it's good for us if it means we can sell more Scottish whisky. That's a point of view, but it's one that, as a welfare organisation, we don't support. We feel that the that it's unfair to British farmers in particular, never mind the animals, it's unfair to farmers to say that we require you to produce to standard X, and by the way, we're letting somebody import to standard Y, which is much less.
How might that be? I just think chicken is a wonderful example because it's the most consumed, I think the most consumed protein in the UK, and a lot of people rely on it. I know we import a lot from a lot of very low welfare chicken from, particularly from Eastern Europe, for example.
Yeah.
If we were to shift the bar, if we were to draw the line in the sand further on from where it is now as to what we accept as our minimum standard, how might we be able to enforce that standard remains from, because presumably these markets that are producing, that are selling to the UK, if it's in significant volume, they will want to continue to have the UK as a customer.
Yeah.
Is there a practical and feasible way that we can enforce our standards on them as producers?
Yes, we can say what we're willing to accept, and they will then, to quite a large extent, adjust accordingly. So, Compassionate World Farming gives annual awards to farms around the world producing to high standards. So, for instance, the Chinese farms, we wouldn't think necessarily, perhaps it's a prejudice, we wouldn't think necessarily that China would be in the forefront of animal welfare. But there are Chinese farms, quite a lot of them, who are interested in exporting to the West, and who also have domestic markets where domestic consumers who want higher welfare. So there's a sector of the Chinese production which feels, yeah, we'd like to have higher standards so we can export to these markets with the clear labeling showing that that it is indeed high welfare. So if we impose a higher bar and say, if you want to have zero tariff access, then you must meet this standard, then obviously there will be some farmers who say, well, no, I'm sorry, it's too difficult. I'm going to export to Bulgaria instead. But that's to some extent up to us. If we say the bar is higher, we will get the goods, and it's up to other countries then to decide whether they want to follow suit.
But you think the markets will respond to that?
But yes, I mean, unless you set the bar to an absolutely impossible level, the market will respond. It may then be more expensive, and so that's the issue.
Yeah.
And ideally, you want to set standards which can be met without tremendous cost implications. And that's part of the research job and part of a job also of DEFRA to try to do research on what can be done in an economically feasible way.
That's really interesting. So in an ideal world for imports and domestically produced foods, we've established that it's a very good idea to shift the baseline of what's acceptable. But from where you were talking there, I can see some real solid arguments for doing that in incremental steps rather than just taking a great leap forward and drawing a new line in the sand and saying deal with it. Is just to push or to have would it be feasible to have a sort of 5-year plan and for everybody to know the changes that are going to come and when they're going to come? Is that something that could work?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that applies domestically as well. If we take farrowing crates, as many of your viewers will know, sows in Britain and most of Western Europe are commonly kept in crates for much of their lives in order to prevent them rolling on the piglets when they're born and squashing them and preventing them growing to provide pork later on. And there are ways of dealing with that, which probably go further than you want want to discuss now, but the well-established models for how you can farm without farrowing crates. And what the pig industry basically says is, yes, we can shift if you really want us to, but who's going to find the money to help us rebuild the pig farm to make it work in that way?
Oh, really? Like an infrastructure problem
Yes,
there. Not
yeah,
just a management problem, but there's a fundamental infrastructure
yes.
change that needs to happen.
Yes, very briefly, one classic way to do it is you have an area which is heated and has a low ceiling where the piglets will naturally gravitate because they like it warm. But because it's low ceiling, the sow can't get in. So the risk that the sow then rolls on the piglets is vastly reduced because the piglets sitting there enjoying the sun and well enjoying the heat. And the sow is outside, and when they want to suckle the sow, then they come out, suckle it, and go back again. Now, obviously, you can't produce that overnight.
Sure.
So, if you've got a classic farm with farrowing crates, if the government said, right, well, for next week you can't have them, then basically you're going to go bust. So, what you need is a transition period. And what we would argue is that the government subsidy system, which assists farmers who've got capital costs, should include an incentive to get on with it. So what the farmer should be hearing from government is in 5 years, we're no longer going to accept farrowing crates. If you move away from them in the next 2 years, we will give you financial assistance to help you do it, and that's should be part of the established assistance program which already exists, which Michael Gove introduced after Brexit. This would be a Brexit dividend, if you like, that we would be doing things differently. We'd be saying we will actually assist farmers in moving to a more humane system, and we'll tell them that if they do it soon, we'll make it worth their while. Otherwise, they'll have to do it a few years down the line.
So carrot and stick in full force.
Yeah.
I've taken up quite a bit more of your time than we originally intended, so I'm going to just ask you one more thing, if we could. That's let's look at best case scenario now. So the work you're doing, the work that we're doing, where would you like to see us in 15 to 20 years from now? How would you like to see the food system in Britain? What would it look like?
I think less and better as far as meat goes. I think the current level of meat consumption is not sustainable, but we do see a varied diet, popularly understood and embraced by consumers, supported by government, and not dependent on fluctuations from imports from around the world. So we'd like to see the sustainable agro-ecological environment developing steadily, so that eventually we get to the point where we actually feel we've got a farming system to be proud of, which we're confident will sustain us in the decades to come. We think it's possible. We think it will happen. Whether it happens soon enough is partly the job of government and of NGOs like ours to make it happen.
Oh, what a wonderful way to wrap up. That was a fantastic soundbite. Thank you very much. Dr. Nick Palmer, thank you so much for being the first podcast guest of C.L.E.A.R campaign. I really appreciate your time, and very much look forward to sharing the information that you've shared with me with everybody else.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity.